Guys, we have more information that bacteria could be used to turn the clock back on aging. We're going to talk all about this on today's episode of Short Stories of Bacteria. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Short Stories of Bacteria. I, as always, am your host, Dr. K, and I'm here to guide you throughout another story chronicling the lives of the tiny and the infamous, and that'll be, of course, bacteria. I have a really cool story to tell you guys today. It's linking bacteria, the microbiome, and the process by which we age, because it turns out there's some really cool links between that, which we're going to discuss. We're going to talk about that in just a couple seconds, but first, don't forget to hit that like, share, subscribe button if you're listening to this on YouTube. If you're listening to this on some other podcast medium, don't forget to hit that follow button to help support the channel and to help support the podcast. But enough about that. Let us jump into the science for today. So as I mentioned at the top of the episode, we're going to be talking about the process of aging, because it turns out all of us get older over time. I am certainly not the spring chicken that I used to be. And even now at this point, I'll wake up and I'll be walking down the stairs and I'll get these like, now I'm a little sorer than I remember being at the age of like 18 years old. So that's great. The point being is that every single one of us is going to age. Right? We're getting older. Now, as we get older, we tend to experience a series of consistent symptoms, right? We'll get these aches, we'll get these pains, we'll maybe get a little bit of inflammation. Sometimes we'll get arthritic in some capacity. And a lot of this is based off of just increases in low-grade inflammation, right? Inflammation occurs like whenever you injure yourself or what have you, but it also just gradually increases as you get older. Okay, this low-grade inflammation can be chronic, and it drives a whole bunch of these different symptoms that we associate with aging. It's associated with, or it drives something called cellular senescence, which is just the process of deterioration, the cells losing their ability to divide. So it drives cellular senescence. It drives a whole bunch of these other components of aging. And so what that means then is that as we get older, if we want to age more gracefully, if we want to get rid of some of the aches and pains that are associated with aging, a way that we could deal with that would be by treating sources of inflammation, right? Because again, that's driving a lot of the symptoms of aging. So if we can treat inflammation, if we can bring down these chronic levels of inflammation, then that in theory should help us with a lot of the symptoms that we experience as we age. Okay, now, that's a really easy thing to say, but it's a really difficult thing to immediately put into practice, because as it turns out, in spite of the fact that inflammation is chronic, it's really multifaceted. There's a whole bunch of different things that go into regulating the process of, or the presence of inflammation. This can be derived from having a hyperactive immune system, or sometimes even a weakened immune system. It can happen when cells are just physically getting older. It can happen as DNA starts to mutate, or DNA starts to break down as we age, right? There's a whole bunch of different things. Each of these different things then influences and increases the amount of inflammation that's occurring, and that's what bumps us up from this kind of what I will call normal level of inflammation that we experience as we're younger to a slightly higher, more chronic presence of inflammation that we get as we get older. Okay. So inflammation is super chronic. It's really multifaceted in terms of the sources of where that inflammation comes from. But it'd be really nice if we could address ways to bring down that inflammation, because as we bring down that inflammation, then in theory, that should be able to push back the clock for a lot of folks as they age, and certainly allows them to age more gracefully and not experience any of these aches and pains and symptoms of getting older. Okay, so our fundamental question then is, what are some of the things that cause inflammation, and how could we go about stopping them? Now, we talked about a few of the different symptoms, like DNA breakdown, cellular senescence, a whole bunch of different aspects to this. It is multifaceted, but there is a group out of University of Illinois, Urbana, and they were trying to address it through the lens of a little guy named bacteria. Now, if you've been with the show for a significant amount of time, you may be like, I think I can maybe pick out ways that this could be linked. The microbiome that we have is related to our immune system. Maybe our immune system has something to do with inflammation or something like that. And that's 100% true. But the main point that these guys wanted to make was that, and this is a really important point, is that our microbiome is going to change over time. right? The microbiome that you have when you are born is different from the microbiome that you have when you're 18 years old, and that microbiome is different from the one that you have when you're 36 or 72. As you get older over time, your microbiome is going to change because its environment is changing, right? It's really going to change as we start to age. Now, what's really interesting is that there's an interesting correlation between the microbiome changes that we see as you get older and the emergence of inflammation and these aging symptoms. Okay? And so what these researchers were thinking was like, oh, okay, maybe it's the case that the microbiome, as it's changing, is influencing and is influenced by the process of aging and these aging symptoms. Okay? So maybe the microbiome is going about, as it changes, it's influencing and causing some of these aging symptoms that we talked about. Now, in order to understand the way that this occurs, we need to talk a little bit about how the microbiome or bacteria interact with our immune system. Now, it turns out that bacteria and other microorganisms have these things called PAMPs. So what is a PAMP? A PAMP is an acronym. It stands for Pathogen-Associated Molecular Pattern. Pathogen-Associated Molecular Pattern. That's really difficult to say in conversation, so people just call them PAMPs. Now, the best way you can think about PAMPs is they're these unique little flags that are unique to an individual pathogen. So, for example, E. coli has a certain set of PAMPs that are unique to it. It's attached to the membrane, and they kind of just are unique markers of E. coli. Similar type of thing with something like tuberculosis. They have a different set of PAMPs, and so the immune system interacts with each of these PAMPs differently. Now, what's important to note is that the presence of these PAMPs, because the immune system recognizes these things, these little flags, these little tags on these different kinds of pathogens, because the immune system recognizes these things, these PAMPs actually dictate the activity of immune system pathways, right? So if you have a whole bunch of different PAMPs from a whole bunch of different pathogens present in your immune system, then the immune system is going to recognize those, and then the degree to which the immune system is active is going to be related to how many and how intense that PAMP concentration is going to be. Okay, so that's a really, really important point to make. Now, one of these immune system pathways, like almost the most important immune system pathway, is something called the toll-like receptor or TLR pathways. These are one of the fundamental pathways of how you activate and regulate the immune system. Okay, and what's really interesting is that these PAMPs are directly related to how active these TLR pathways are. Okay, so if you have tons of different PAMPs, then you have a hyperactive levels of TLR pathway activation. Okay, now what's really cool, and this is another link in the chain now, is the degree of the activity of these pathways, of these TLR pathways, is correlated with the amount of inflammation that's present in the body. Okay, I'm going to say that again. The degree of activity of these pathways, these TLR pathways, is correlated with the amount of inflammation. Okay, and so then the theory is, and this is what these researchers were thinking, was that because of the presence of these PAMPs, because those PAMPs change as aging occurs, the theory would be that as these PAMPs change, then that is modulating how active TLR pathways are and making them more active. And in doing so, as you make these TLR pathways more active, then you're increasing the relative levels of inflammation, and then that could be causing these aging symptoms that we talked about earlier in the podcast. Okay, so now in order to demonstrate this, they had to have a proof of concept experiment. They had to show that this is actually something that would work. And so what they did is they took old mice microbiomes. Okay, so they took old mice, they extracted the microbiomes from these old mice, and then they gave them to young mice. And what was interesting is they looked at the level of activation of these TLR receptors, these TLR pathways that I mentioned before, and they found that when you take the old mouse microbiome, give it to the young mouse, it leads to a much more hyperactive activation of these TLR pathways. Okay, that's the first thing. Now, the second thing is because of these high levels of TLR activation, this actually led to a whole bunch of these symptoms that are associated with aging, right? It led to colon inflammation, it led to intestinal barrier disruption, a whole bunch of these other different factors that immediately lead to chronic levels of inflammation. Okay, so that was a really, really cool experiment. And this is our final point, that by giving young mice an old microbiome, they activated the immune system in such a way that led to inflammation and presumably aging as a result of that. Now, this is a really, really cool story. It demonstrates, and there's more aspects to this. They talked about how these mice that received this older microbiome were then less susceptible to antibiotics, which is a whole different beast, but it's also related to the immune system for sure. What I wanted to emphasize here, most important point here, was the fact that bacteria actually have a really cool and fundamental impact on the process of aging, right? We're all aging at our different rates or what have you, and we're all getting older. But the point is that by activating our immune system in a very specific way, due to the fact that our microbiome changes over time, this could be leading to some of these chronic inflammation and these symptoms of aging that we get. Now, that's obviously not the end of the story. In theory, what you could do is, if you could curate the microbiome a little bit better, or if you could have more targeted antibiotics to prevent the bacteria that have these PAMPs that are activating the TLR pathways, if you could modulate the microbiome and make it a little more curated, in theory, then you could have greater longevity, you could have lower inflammation, you could have a much more graceful process of aging because you're not activating this immune system in a very specific way. But again, that is a whole nother question. That's something that obviously other researchers are going to have to figure out as we travel down the pathway of time. But let's wrap this up and then let's get out of here for today. So our first point was that a big component of aging is inflammation. A lot of the symptoms that we experience in aging come from chronic levels of inflammation that are present over time. The second major point is that it appears that our microbiome influences and is influenced by aging. There are changes to the microbiome over time as we get older. Our third point, and this is the really cool one, is that because of things like PAMPs, bacteria can activate the immune system pathways that cause inflammation. Remember, we talked about those TLR pathways. And then finally, we talked about this proof of concept experiment, how the researchers took an old microbiome from an older mouse and gave it to a younger mouse. And this did two things. Number one, it activated the immune system in such a way that it led to inflammation. And number two, it started giving symptoms that are associated with aging, right? So again, I don't know anyone who wants to live forever. I'm sure there's lots of folks that want to live a really, really long time, but no one I don't think really wants to live forever. But I'm sure pretty much everyone wants to age in a graceful way, and they want to avoid some of these aches and pains that we naturally get as we get older. And it turns out one of the ways that you could do that maybe is by just a little bit of bacterial curation and being cognizant of our microbiome as we get older. But that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much, each and every single one of you guys, for tuning in, and I hope I'll see you guys again next week on another episode of Short Stories of Bacteria.